Chapter 16. Enter Coffee Jim. Probably the disposition to rest on our laurels is more than anything else responsible for the mediocrity of the individual and the slow progress of the race. Having accomplished something, most of us spend some time in admiring it and ourselves. It is characteristic of big men that past achievements do not hold their interest. They are concerned only with their efforts to accomplish still more in the future. Henry Ford had built an automobile. His 4 years' work had been successful, and that little machine, scarcely larger than a bicycle, with its pulley clutch, puffing little one-cylinder engine, and crude steering apparatus, stood for an epoch in human progress. He might be pardoned if he had spent a month or two in self-congratulation, in driving the car up and down Detroit's streets, and enjoying the comments of the men who had laughed at him so long. But apparently it did not occur to him. He saw already a number of possible improvements in the little machine. He was as indifferent to the praise of other men as he had been to their ridicule. After that one day of rest he resumed almost the old routine. When a few men at the Edison plant laughingly inquired how he was getting along with the great invention, he remarked quietly that the machine was running. He had been riding in it already. Then at 6 o'clock he hurried home and out to the shed for the usual evening's work. He was trying to plan an engine which would give more power. Incidentally, in his odd moments he was working to improve the steering apparatus. One imagines the incredulity, the amazement, that followed his quiet statement that the thing was actually running. The men at the plant began to drop around at the Ford place to look at it. They came doubtfully, prepared either to laugh or to be convinced. After they had examined the engine and looked over the transmission and steering gear, they went away still hesitating between two conclusions. "It works all right," they said. "There's no question the blamed thing runs. How do you suppose he ever happened to stumble onto the idea? But where's he going to get the capital to manufacture it? After all, there won't be much of a market. A few rich fellows will buy it, probably, for the novelty. After all, you can't make a machine that will do the work of horses to any great extent." Some of them took a different view. They became enthusiastic. "My Lord, Ford, there's millions in this thing, millions," they said. "You ought to get out and organize a company, a big company, incorporate and sell stock and make a clean-up right away, and then build a machine like a phaeton, with big leather cushions and carriage lamps and a lot of enamel finish. Why, there are hundreds of men that could afford to pay $2,000 or $3,000 for one of them. You could make 100% profit, 200%. Ford listened to all of them and said little. He was busy improving the machine. It did not suit him yet. He felt he could make it much more powerful and efficient with a little more work. Meantime he revolved in his mind plans for putting it on the market. Those plans included always one fundamental point. He was resolved to make the automobile cheap. "I've got a machine here that saves time and work and money," he said. "The more people who have it, the more it will save. There's no object in building it so only a few rich men can own one. It isn't the rich men who need it. It's the common folks like me." News of the amazing machine to be seen in the old shed behind the little house on Edison Street spread rapidly. About this time news dispatches carried word of two other automobiles built in this country. A man named Duryea of Springfield, Illinois, and another named Haynes in Kokomo, Indiana, had been working on the same idea. A reporter found Ford at work on his engine, interviewed him, and wrote a story for a Detroit paper. One or two wealthy men hunted Ford up and talked about furnishing the capital to manufacture the machine. They saw, as some of Ford's friends had done, an opportunity to float a big company, sell stock, and build a high-priced car. Ford considered these offers for a time. Building an automobile had been only half his idea. Building it cheap had been the other half, and he would not abandon it. He figured it out in dollars and cents. 200% on a small quantity of cars, or a smaller profit on a larger quantity. He showed that the most sound basis for the company was the manufacture of a large number of machines, at a profit sufficient merely to keep enlarging the plant and building more machines. The idea did not appeal to the men who were eager for large immediate profits for themselves. In the end, the men with money dropped the matter. Ford was obstinate, but he was a small man with no capital, merely a crank who had hit by accident on a good idea. He would come around all right in time, they concluded. Ford continued to work at the Edison plant and spend his evenings trying to improve his machine. He had taken Mrs. Ford to Greenfield, where she would stay with her mother until the baby was born. After that one hysterical outburst on the night the automobile was finished, she had returned to her cheerful acceptance of his interest in the car. Indeed, she herself had become enthusiastic about its possibilities. "You stay right here and keep your job with the Edison people," she said. "I'll be perfectly all right with Mother, and maybe by the time I come back you'll have a company organized and a whole factory going. Who knows? Only mind you don't work too late at night, and promise you'll eat your meals regular." Ford promised, but when he returned to the dark little house at night and faced the task of building a fire and cooking supper for himself, it seemed to him a bigger job than building the automobile had been. He heated some coffee on the gasoline stove, burned some bread into a semblance of toast, and scrambled a few eggs. Then he spread a newspaper on the kitchen table, set the frying pan on it, and managed to make a meal. Naturally, about midnight he grew hungry. He came into the kitchen, looked at the cold, greasy frying pan, still setting on the kitchen table, remembered that he was out of bread, and thought of an all-night lunch wagon that stood near Substation A, where sometimes he bought a cup of coffee when he was working there. The automobile stood waiting in the shed. He told himself that he wanted to test the steering gear again anyway. He went out, started the engine, climbed in and chugged away through the silent, deserted streets to the lunch wagon. Coffee Jim, loafing among his pans and mounds of Hamburg steak, was astonished to see the queer little machine jerking and coughing its way toward him. He remembered Ford, and while he sliced the onions and cut the bread for Ford's midnight luncheon they talked about the automobile. Afterward Coffee Jim examined it in detail and marveled. When Ford took him for a little ride in it he became enthusiastic. Soon it was part of Ford's routine to drive the little car to the lunch wagon at midnight, have a cup of coffee and a hot sandwich, and a chat with Coffee Jim. They became friends. It was one of those accidental relationships which have great consequences. 100,000 Ford automobiles today owe their existence largely to that chance friendship between Ford and Coffee Jim. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Another 8 years. If Ford had been unduly elated over his success in making an automobile, the years that followed that night ride in the train would have been one succession of heartbreaking disappointments. Men with money enough to build a factory were not seeking business ventures in the 90s. Money was scarce, and growing more so. The few financiers who might have taken up Ford's invention floated a big issue of common stock and sold the cars at a profit of 200 or 300%, saw no advantage in furnishing the capital to start a small plant on Ford's plan. He himself was close pressed for money. Payments on the little house, with their interest, the cost of his wife's illness and of providing for the new baby, his own living expenses, took the greater part of his salary. The situation would have been disheartening to most men. Ford set his teeth and kept on working. The one-cylinder engine bothered him. It did not give him the power he wanted. After he had worked with it for a time he took it down, cut another section from the piece of pipe and made another cylinder. The two-cylinder result was somewhat better, but still the little car jerked along over the ground and did not satisfy him. He fell back into the old routine, 12 hours at the Edison plant, home to supper, and out to the shed to work the evening through on the machine. Mrs. Ford was in charge of the house again, busy keeping it neat and bright, nursing the baby, making his little dresses, washing and ironing, keeping down the grocer's bills. Meantime other men, with machines no better than Ford's, were starting factories and manufacturing automobiles. Once in a while, on his way home from work, Ford saw one on the street. A horseless carriage, shining with black enamel, upholstered with deep leather cushions, ornamented with elaborate brass carriage lamps. Usually they were driven by steam engines. They were a curiosity in Detroit's streets, a luxury which only the very rich might afford. Crowds gathered to look at them. Ford must have seen them with some bitterness, but apparently he was not greatly discouraged. "I didn't worry much. I knew I could put my idea through somehow," he says. "I tell you, no matter how things may look, any project that's founded on the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number will win in the end. It's bound to." He went home, ate the supper Mrs. Ford had waiting, and doggedly resumed work in the old shed. The chronicle of those years from the standpoint of an onlooker would be merely a wearisome record of the machine shop, a detailed record of pistons, number of revolutions per minute, experiments in spark timing. Only the knowledge of their result, or Ford's own story of his hopes, disappointments, mental struggles, would make them interesting. That part of his story Ford will not dwell upon. "I kept on working another 8 years," he said quietly. 8 years! Some time during them he saw what was needed. Heretofore the crankshaft had made a complete revolution on a single power impulse. Ford perceived that 2 impulses, properly placed, would increase both the power and the smoothness of the running. The result of that quiet 8 years' work was the first practical 2-cylinder opposed engine mounted on a motor car. In the little shed, working alone through the long evenings, while his neighbors rested and visited on their front porches, and his wife sang the baby to sleep in the house, he built the 4-cycle engine that made the gasoline automobile a possibility. In the spring of 1901 he finished it, mounted it on the old car, which he had made 9 years before of discarded bicycle wheels and rough boards, and drove it out of the shed. It was nearly midnight of a quiet starlit spring night. The lights in nearby houses had gone out long before. In his own home Mrs. Ford and the boy were sleeping soundly. Ford turned the car down Edison Avenue and put on full power. The engine responded beautifully. The car raced down the avenue, under the branches of the trees whose buds were swelling with spring sap, while the wind lifted Ford's hair and blew hard against his face. It was pleasant after the long hours in the shed. The steady throb of the motor, the car's even progress, were delightful. "By George, I'll just ride down and show this to Coffee Jim," said Ford. His circle of acquaintances in Detroit was small. His long hours of work prevented his cultivating them. At the Edison plant his pleasant but rather retiring manner had won only a casual friendliness from the men. This friendliness that had grown since his success with the motor had replaced their derision with respect, but still it was far from intimate companionship. He knew no one with money. He was still a poor man, working for wages, with only his brain and hands for equipment. Nearly 13 years of hard work had produced his motor car, but he had very little money and no financial backing for its manufacture. His closest friend was Coffee Jim. Coffee Jim examined the car with interest that night. He left his lunch wagon and took a short ride in it. He listened while Ford explained its mechanical principle. "You've got a winner there, all right," he said heartily. "All you need is capital." Ford agreed with him. He had been revolving in his mind plans for getting it. When he left Coffee Jim at his lunch wagon and rode slowly home, he continued to think about it. That morning he drove to the Edison plant in the car, and on his way home at night he made a detour through Detroit's principal streets. He wanted people to talk about the car, and they did. Everyone in Detroit heard more or less about it in the months that followed. Meantime, Ford took a few days' leave from the Edison plant now and then, and personally made efforts to interest financiers in its manufacture. He interviewed his banker and most of the big business men of the city, outlined his plan for a factory, demonstrated the car, Everyone showed some interest, but Ford did not get the money. Late that fall he discussed the situation with Coffee Jim one night. "I've got the car and I've got the right idea," he said. "It's bound to win in time. The trouble is these men can't get an idea until they see it worked out with their own eyes. What I need is some spectacular exhibition of the car. If I could enter her in the races next year, she'd stand a chance to win over anything there'll be in the field. Then these men would fall over themselves to back me." "Well, can't you do it?" Coffee Jim inquired. Ford shook his head. "Cost too much," he said. "I've laid off work a lot this summer trying to get capital, and the boy's been sick. I'd have to buy a new car for the racing. I might rake up money enough for material, but I couldn't make the car in time, working evenings, and I can't afford to give up my job and spend my whole time on it." End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Winning a Race. Coffee Jim pondered the situation. He knew Ford thoroughly. He believed in the car. To win the Grosse Pointe races would give Ford his chance, a chance he was missing for lack of money. Coffee Jim thought of his own bank account, which had been growing for years, nickel by nickel, dime by dime, from the profits on fried ham sandwiches and hamburger and onions. "See here, Ford," he said suddenly, "I'll take a chance. I'll back you. You go on, quit your job, build that car and race her. I'll put up the money." Ford accepted the offer without hesitation. He believed in the car. Coffee Jim waved aside Ford's suggestion of securing the loan by his personal note or by a mortgage on the little house. "Take the money. That's all right. Pay it back when you can. Your word's good enough for me," he said. He believed in Ford. It was a demonstration of the practical value of friendship, a pure sentiment which had come unexpectedly to the rescue when all material means had failed. Hard work, real ability, business sagacity had been unable to give Ford the start which his friendship with the owner of the little lunch wagon had brought him. It was one of those experiences which helped to form Ford's business philosophy, that philosophy which sounds so impractical and has proved so successful. "Any man who considers everything from the standpoint of the most good to the most people will never want for anything," he says. No, I don't mean mental influence or psychic attraction or anything like that. I mean plain common sense. That's the attitude that makes friends. All kinds of friends, everywhere, some that you never even hear about. And friends bring all the rest. He took Coffee Jim's money, gave up his job at the Edison plant, and went to work on the little racer. "It seemed pretty good to be able to work all day on the car, as well as the evenings," he says. He took down the engine and entirely rebuilt it, substituting the best of material for the makeshifts he had been obliged to use. He spent long hours designing a racing body, figuring out problems of air resistance and weight. 8 months of careful thought and work went into that car. At last, in the early summer of 1902, it was finished. At 4 o'clock one morning, business being over at the lunch wagon, he and Coffee Jim took it out for a trial. It ran like the wind. Down the quiet, vacant streets of Detroit, in the gray chill of early morning, they raced at a speed that made the houses on either side blur into a gray haze. Coffee Jim clung breathlessly to the mechanic's seat, while Ford bent over the steering lever and gave her more power and still more power. "Holy Moses, she sure does run!" Coffee Jim gasped when the car slowed down smoothly and stopped. "You'll win that race sure as shooting." "Yes, she's a good little car," Ford said, looking it over critically. "She's a pretty good little car." He stood looking at it, his hands in his pockets. "I've got an idea for a 4-cylinder motor that will beat her, though," he said. "It's too late to build it now. We'll have to put this one in the race. But I'll make a car yet that'll beat this as much as this beats a bicycle." It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. The little racer was finished, thoroughly well done. He spent no more thought on it. Already his mind was reaching ahead, planning a better one. It may be imagined with what anxiety the Fords awaited the day of the races. Ford was to be his own driver, and Mrs. Ford's dread of losing the race was mixed with fear for his safety if there should be an accident. She had seen the car in the tryout, and its speed terrified her, though Ford assured her, with masculine clumsiness, that even greater speed had been made in previous races. Alexander Winton of Cleveland, then the track champion of the country, had beaten it more than once. On the race track, Ford said, he was confident he could do better. Later there was a quiet tryout on the race track that showed Ford he was right, though he kept secret the exact time he had made. On the day of the races enormous crowds gathered at the Grosse Pointe tracks. It was the first automobile track meeting ever held in Michigan, and excitement ran high. Alexander Winton was there, confident and smiling in his car, which had broken so many records. The crowds cheered him wildly. Ford, quiet and perhaps a little white with the tension, drove his car out on the tracks, was greeted with a few uncertain cheers. "Who's that?" people said. "Oh, that's a Detroit man. Let's see, what is his name? Ford. Never heard of him before. Funny little car, isn't it? Maybe he's been put in to fill out. He's the only man against Winton in the free-for-all. They couldn't get a real car to race Winton." "Hi, there's Cooper. Cooper, rah!" The crowd got to its feet and cheered Tom Cooper, the bicycle champion, who strolled onto the field and chatted with Winton. Ford was outside it all. He had been too busy working on his car, had had too little money to be on intimate terms with the big men of the automobile business or to become friendly with champions. One supposes he wasted no regrets on the situation. He had his car, the concrete form of his mechanical ideas. The time had come to test their value. If they were right, he would win the race. If they were wrong, he would go back to his shed and work out better ones. He examined the car again, looked to the gasoline and oil, and was ready. Coffee Jim, slapping him on the shoulder, said, "All right, Ford, go to it," and hurried up to his seat in the grandstand, where Mrs. Ford and the boy were already sitting, tense with excitement and apprehension. Winton waved his cap in a last response to the roar from the crowd, pulled it down tight and settled back into his seat. The signal came. Ford, bending over his steering lever, threw on the power and felt the car jump forward. The race was on. It happened 13 years ago, but there are still people in Detroit who talk of that race. They describe the start, the enthusiasm for Winton, the surprise of the crowd when the little car, driven by nobody knew whom, hung on grimly just behind the champion, to the end of the first stretch, through the second stretch, well on to the third. Winton's car shot ahead then. The crowd cheered him madly. Then the roar died down in amazement. The little car, with a burst of speed, overtook the champion, and the two cars shot past the grandstand side by side and sped into the second lap. Into the silence came a yell from Coffee Jim. "Ford! Yah, Ford! Go it, go it, go it! Ford!" The crowd went crazy. No one knew clearly what was happening. "Ford! Ford! Winton! He's ahead! Go it, go it! Winton! Come on, come on! Look at him, look at him! Ford!" they yelled. Then the two cars swept into the final stretch abreast. The crowd, wild with excitement, hoarse, disheveled, was standing on the seats roaring, "Come on, come on, come on! Ford, Ford!" Every detail of that race must still be distinct in Ford's mind, but he sums them all in one concise sentence: "It was some race. I won it." End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Raising Capital. Ford sat in his little car, white, shaken, dusty, the track champion of this country. He was surrounded by a small crowd of automobile enthusiasts, promoters, bicycle champions, all eager to meet and talk with the unknown man who had taken the honors away from Winton. Among them was Tom Cooper. Grasping Ford's hand, he looked with interest at the slightly built, thin-cheeked man who had won the race and said, "Bully work, the way you handled her on that last turn. Whose car is it?" "Mine," said Ford. "I mean," Cooper looked at the lines of the car, "I mean, whose engine did you use?" "It's my engine. I made it," Ford replied. "The deuce you did!" Cooper exclaimed. "Well, I must say you did a good job. I'd like to look it over sometime." "Sure, come out to my house any time. Glad to show it to you," said Ford cordially. It was the beginning of an association which was to be highly profitable to both of them. Other men of national prominence in the world of sports greeted Ford enthusiastically as one of themselves, while the crowd in the grandstand still cheered spasmodically. Reporters hurried up with cameramen, and Ford stepped back into the little car and posed somewhat sheepishly for his first newspaper pictures. Men who had formerly passed him on the street with a careless nod now stopped him, clapped him on the shoulder, and talked like old friends. He was beyond question the hero of the day. He took it all in a matter-of-fact manner. His car had done no more than he had expected all along, and it was the car, not himself, which filled his mind. He hoped that the publicity would bring him the necessary capital to start his factory. Within a week he received offers from wealthy men of Detroit. The local papers had printed pictures of Ford, his car, and the old shed where it had been built, with long accounts of his years of work and his efforts to organize a company. Detroit had been awakened to the fact that there was a real opportunity for men with vision and sufficient capital to carry it out. But without exception these men insisted on one thing: absolute control of the company to be organized. From their standpoint that proviso was reasonable enough. If they furnished the money and Ford merely the idea, of course they should keep not only the larger share of the profits, but entire control of the venture as well. Without their money, they argued, his idea was valueless. On the other hand, in spite of his 8 years of struggle for lack of capital, Ford still maintained that the idea was the really valuable part of the combination. He insisted on controlling the organization which was to manufacture his cars. While he had been working alone in the little shed at night, he had thought out his plan for a factory, mentally picturing its methods, its organization, the handling of material from the raw iron to the finished cars, fully assembled, rolling away in an endless line. He had figured costs to the fraction of a cent, planned methods of arranging the work, standardizing the product, eliminating waste and friction at every possible point. Now that the car was finished, the factory plan took its place in his mind. He did not intend to abandon it until he had made it a reality. He was going to build that factory, as he had built his engine, in spite of any obstacles or opposition. To do it he must control the company's policies. It was a deadlock. To the man with money it seemed sheer insanity to put control of a business venture into the hands of an obstinate mechanic who had happened to hit on an idea for an automobile engine. Ford would not dispose of his patents on any other condition. In a short time the discussions were dropped, and he was where he had been before the track meeting. That spectacular race, however, had brought him many acquaintances, and many of them developed into close friends. James Couzens, a small hardware merchant of Detroit, was one of them, and C.H. Wills, a mechanical draftsman, was another. With Tom Cooper, the bicycle champion, they spent many evenings in the old shed or on the front steps of the Ford house, discussing projects for the Ford factory. Couzens, who had a talent for business affairs, formed a plan for interesting a small group of merchants like himself in financing Ford. He brought negotiations to a certain point and found himself confronted again by their demand for control of the company. "We must do something that'll show them that they've got to have you on your own terms. Something big, startling, to stir them up," he reported. "How about winning another race?" Cooper suggested. "They're pulling one off in Ohio this fall." "No, it must be right here so I can take my men out and let them see it," Couzens objected. "It takes a lot to jar any money loose from those fellows." "I could enter at the Grosse Pointe tracks next spring," Ford said, "but it wouldn't show them any more than they've already seen if I raced the same car. I can't afford to build another one." He was still in debt to Coffee Jim for the cost of his first racer. Coffee Jim, professing himself satisfied with the results of the race — doubtless he had judiciously placed some bets on it — had left Detroit in the meantime, but Ford nevertheless counted the loan among his liabilities. "Think you can beat that car?" Cooper inquired. "I know I can," Ford replied quietly. "Then you go to it and build her. I'll back the scheme," Cooper said. It was another debt on Ford's shoulders, but he accepted it and immediately began to work on another racer. With the intention of startling Couzens' group of sedate business men, he obeyed Cooper's injunction to "build her big, the roof's the limit." The result was certainly startling. 4 enormous cylinders gave that engine 80 horsepower. When it was finished and Cooper and Ford took it out one night for a trial, people started from their sleep for blocks about the Ford house. The noise of the engine could be heard miles. Flames flashed from the motor. In the massive framework was one seat. Cooper stood thunderstruck while Ford got in and grasped the tiller. "Good Lord, how fast do you figure she'll do?" he asked. "Don't know," Ford replied. He put on the power. There was a mighty roar, a burst of flame, and Cooper stood alone on the curb. Far down the street he saw the car thundering away. A few minutes later it came roaring back and stopped. Ford sat in it, white. "How far did you go?" Cooper asked. Ford told him. "Do you mean to say she makes a speed like that?" Cooper ejaculated, aghast. "She'll make better than that. I didn't dare to give her full power," Ford replied. He climbed out and stood beside Cooper, and the two looked at the car in awe. "See here, I hope you don't think I'll drive that thing in the races," Cooper said after a time. "I wouldn't do it for a gold mine. You'll have to do it." "I should say not," Ford retorted. "I won't take the responsibility of driving her at full speed to win every race that was ever run. Cooper, if that car ever gets really started it will kill somebody sure." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Clinging to a Principle. Ford and Cooper regarded the juggernaut car for some time in meditative silence. "Well, I guess you've built a real racer there, all right," Cooper said admiringly. "Yes, it looks as if I had," Ford answered. "The question is, what good is it? Is there a man on earth who'd try to drive it?" "Well, I've got some nerve myself, and I don't want to," Cooper admitted. He walked around the car and then looked again at the engine. "How fast would the darn thing go, I wonder?" he said. "Get in and try her," Ford suggested. Cooper climbed in, Ford cranked the engine, and again sleeping Detroit jumped from its bed. The car leaped and shot down the avenue. When it roared back again, Cooper stopped it in the middle of the street. "That settles it for me," he said. "She must have made 40 miles an hour, and she wasn't half running at that. I won't take her out on the track." They confronted the situation gloomily. Couzens was depending on the success of the car at the races to bring his men in line for the organization of a company. Here was the car, built at the cost of months of work and some hundreds of Cooper's money, and it developed such speed that it was not safe to enter it for the race. Suddenly Cooper had an idea. "See here, I know a man. If there's a man on earth who would take that car out he's the one," he said. "He isn't afraid of anything under the shining sun. A bicycle rider I raced against in Denver. Oldfield's his name, Barney Oldfield." "Never heard of him," said Ford. "But if you think he would drive this car let's get hold of him. Where is he?" "He ought to be in Salt Lake now," Cooper answered. "I'll wire him." The message went to Oldfield that night. Couzens was told of the situation, and the three men waited anxiously for a telegram from Salt Lake. It came late the next day, asking some further questions about the car, and stating that Oldfield had never driven an automobile. Cooper wired again. The track meeting was to be held the next month. Time was short. Oldfield, if he came, would have to learn every detail of handling the machine. Even with an experienced man, the danger of driving that car in the races was great. Cooper and Ford haunted the telegraph offices. At last the final reply came. Oldfield would drive the car. He would arrive on the 1st of June, exactly 1 week before the date of the race. It was a busy week. Ford and Cooper bent every energy to teaching Oldfield how to drive the car. They crammed his mind with a mass of facts about the motor, the factor of safety in making quick turns, the way to handle the steering lever. On the day before the races he took the car out on the tracks and made one circuit safely, holding it down to slow speed. "I can handle her all right. I'll let her out tomorrow," he reported. The day of the track meeting dawned. Ford and Cooper, tense with anxiety, went over the car thoroughly and coached Oldfield for the last time. Couzens, hiding his nervousness under a bland, confident manner, gathered his group of business men and took them into the grandstand. The free-for-all was called. Half a dozen cars were entered. When they had found their places in the field, Barney Oldfield settled himself in his seat, firmly grasped the two-handed tiller which steered the mighty car, and remarked, "Well, this chariot may kill me, but they'll say afterward that I was going some when the car went over the bank." Ford cranked the engine and the race was on. Oldfield, his long hair snapping in the wind, shot from the midst of the astounded field like a bullet. He did not dare look around. He merely clung to the tiller and gave that car all the power it had. At the end of the first half mile he was far in the lead and gaining fast. The crowd, astounded, hysterical with excitement, saw him streak past the grandstand a quarter of a mile ahead of the nearest car following. On the second lap he still gained. Grasping the tiller, never for a second relaxing that terrific speed, he spun around the course again, driving as if the field was at his heels. He roared in at the finish, a full half-mile ahead of the nearest car, in a 3-mile race. News of the feat went around the world, and in one day Ford was hailed as a mechanical genius. Couzens brought the group of business men down to the track, and before Oldfield was out of the car they had made an appointment to meet Ford next day and form a company. The race had convinced them. "Some people can't see a thing unless it is written in letters a mile high and then illustrated with a diagram," Ford says meditatively. During the following week a company was formed, and Ford was made vice president, general manager, superintendent, master mechanic, and designer. He held a small block of stock and was paid a salary of $150 a month, the same amount he had drawn while working for the Edison company. He was satisfied. The salary was plenty for his needs. Apparently he waved that subject aside as of little importance. At last, he thought, he had an opportunity to put into practice his plans for manufacturing, to build up an organization which was to be as much a Ford factor as his car was a Ford car. The machine idea was to be its basis. The old idea for the 50-cent watch factory, altered and improved by years of consideration, was at last to be carried out. He planned a system of smooth, economical efficiency, producing enormous numbers of cheap, standardized cars, and he began work on it with all the enthusiasm he had felt when he first began building his car. But almost immediately there was friction between him and the men who furnished the capital. They insisted on his designing not cheaper cars, but more luxurious ones. They demanded that his saving in reduced costs of production should be added to their profits, not deducted from the price of the car. They were shrewd, successful businessmen, and they intended to run their factory on business lines. "I prefer not to talk about that year," Ford says today. "Those men were right, according to their lights. I suppose, anyway, some of them are still building a fairly successful car in the $3,000 to $4,000 class, and I don't want to criticize other men in the automobile field. The trouble was that they couldn't see things my way. They could not understand that the thing that is best for the greatest number of people is bound to win in the end. They said I was impractical, that notions like that would hurt business. They said ideals were all very well, but they wouldn't work. I did not know anything about business, they said. There was an immediate profit of 200% in selling a high-priced car. Why take the risk of building 40 cheap cars at 5% profit? They said common people would not buy automobiles anyway. I thought the more people who had a good thing the better. My car was going to be cheap, so the man that needed it most could afford to buy it. I kept on designing cheaper cars. They objected. Finally it came to a point where I had to give up my idea or get out of the company. Of course I got out. Over 30 years old, with a wife and child to support and no capital, Henry Ford, still maintaining that policy of the greatest good to the greatest number must win in the end, left the company which had given him an opportunity to be a rich man, and announced that somehow he would manufacture his own car in his own way. End of chapter 20.